And obviously, when this stress on work is at least superficially similar to the type of work that I talked about in terms of Bloch. But at the end of the day, many people have criticized Derrida for the exact opposite thing that I brought out in terms of criticisms of Bloch. Especially in the volume Ghostly Demarcations, a symposium on Jacques Derrida's Specter of Marx, theorist after theorist will come out and say, basically, Derrida, you have given us nothing. You've given us the vaguest of the vague. And that probably no one's as stinging as Terry Eagleton is when he states, Derrida has now taken Marxism on board, or at least dragged it halfway up the gangplank, because he is properly enraged by liberal capitalist complacency. But there is also something unavoidably opportunist about this political pact, which wants to exploit Marxism as critique, dissent, a conveniently belaboring instrument, but is far less willing to engage with its positivity. So at the end of the day, we have Bloch's positive, still vague yet still positive in the sense of bringing about plans and sort of concrete visions of what utopia might be, and Derrida's seemingly very negative, deconstructive understanding in the messianic of what utopia might be. I don't want to go into it, but I'll try to wrap it up, because what's interesting about these two is when we bring them together, I think, especially on this concept of work, we get not only a stronger concept in terms of utopia in general, but we get a stronger concept in terms of Marxism. And let me go into briefly what my thoughts are on this, because especially recently, there have been a number of people who have been trying to re-engage with the concept of utopia, especially people who have been working in the Marxist tradition, such as Frederick Jameson. And I don't know if you've seen his book, Archaeologies of the Future. There's a very fascinating quote in this, where he says that in postmodernity, and this is his understanding of postmodernity, not a completely groundless postmodernity, but an especially obscured, fragmented, time, space, compression, rife capitalism characterized by flexible accumulation, that what is important about utopias is valorizing the plurality of possible utopias. Let me read a quote from James from Archaeologies. Wish fulfillments are, after all, by definition, never really fulfillments of desire, and must presumably always be marked by the hollowness of absence or the failure at the heart of the most dearly fantasized vision, a point Ernst Bloch never tired of making. Even the process of wish fulfillment includes a kind of reality principle of its own, intent on not making things too easy for itself, accumulating the objections and the reality problems that stand in its way so as the more triumphantly and realistically to overcome them. Let me go on and read another quote. And this quote stresses not just the importance of incomplete utopias today, but the plurality of utopias. Jameson observes that in a number of recent works, and especially he goes through a number of different science fiction works, there is a new formal tendency in which it is not the representation of utopia, but rather the conflict of all possible utopia, and the arguments about the nature and desirability of utopia as such, which move to the center of attention. And this, to me, is incredibly important in addressing the sort of the reality of not only undergraduates who have seen every type of utopia, every type of vision of a perfect future society, whether it be Marxist or capitalist, ecological, when they're in a reality that seems to be so bereft of utopia, that bringing about a number of different utopias, a plurality of utopias, becomes all the more powerful concept. And furthermore, if the core of Marxist utopia, and a number of different theorists have said this, people such as Shlomo Avineri, Bertel Omen, who's at this conference, have stressed that in full communism, usually when people talk about Marxist understanding of utopia, they say there are two phases of communism. There is there is phase one communism right after the revolution, where there will still be many of the remnants of capitalism in existence. But in the second or fuller stage of communism, that work, that unalienated work, will be the core of this vision. That if we understand both Bloch and Derrida as theorists of utopian work, and when we place them together, that if we conceive as a full concept of utopian work, necessitating a positive Blochian phase and a negative Derridian phase, and these two phases are reiterated in, once again, a dialectical manner, oscillating between the particular and the universal, the ideal and the material, that these two concepts, when placed together, can have an even stronger affiliation with Marx's understanding of a utopian work, where one might hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, and criticize at night, where one works in relations of production that are not characterized by singular, reified divisions of labor. Here, let me read a brief quote from Hudson, who brings up this possibility. And the latter part of my paper is when I go through and really try to parse out what this might mean. But let me read this. Bloch provides critical materials for a history and geography of desire and for an analysis of utopian figures and texts which indicate a referent not present in their discourse. He also develops a concept of traces which could be usefully challenged in light of a Derridian semantics, with its emphasis upon difference and erasure. Bloch's work as a whole is subject to a Derridian critique. It also contains elements for a positive deconstruction of Western metaphysics against Derrida, based on the insight that the meaning which is never completely present has a positive rather than a negative connotation. And thinking about them together, and thinking about them, especially when we go through, and I think I'll end on this, a concrete exercise. And at the end of my paper, what I do is I take a look at how both of these theorists approach the French Revolution, because both of them discuss it as one of the key elements for contemporary bourgeois utopian thought. You know, it's the foundation, really, for the rights of man, you know, in all of its imperfections, you know, obviously taking the terror into account, but, you know, the Declaration of Rights of Man. And whereas Bloch will take a look at what happened in 1789 and say, well, there's a kernel there. Even in the assertion of the rights of bourgeois man, there is what he will call a trace of not yet political power and socialized freedom. And Derrida will go on and say, well, still, even within any sort of utopian socialized freedom, there is an excluded other. And if we think about this effort to think about the French Revolution, not in and of itself, but as the material upon which the cultivation of a utopian attitude could come about, that's where I see the real possibilities, the advantages, and a understanding of utopia that might not only be more convincing to Marxists who have traditionally eschewed the concept of utopia, but also to my students who really see very little hope in the future at all. Thank you.